Hello, fellow Americans. I'm coming to you from room 111, and I am going to read to you a portion of chapter 7 so that you can answer the questions that I've posted for you on Edmodo using Google Drive to email me back the answers to the questions. So this is a step-by-step process. The first process is to read the information. The second process is to answer the questions. And the third process is to email those questions back to me by using the share portion of Google Docs. So if you have questions on that, you can get me on Edmodo, but I want to start by reading a part of the chapter. So this is part 7.4, page 90. After abandoning Boston in the spring of 1776, Germain came up with his first plan for winning the war. British forces led by William Howe were ordered to capture New York City. From that base, the British troops would then move north to destroy the rebels' heart in Massachusetts. To block this invasion, Washington hurried his army from Boston to New York. It was there that he heard the good news that Congress had finally declared independence for the colonies to be free and independent states. Washington had the Declaration of Independence read out loud to his troops. The time had come, he said, now to show our enemies the whole world that free men contending for their own land are superior to any mercenaries on earth. Most of the men agreed that independence was a prize worth fighting for. African Americans and the war. For African Americans, however, the Declaration of Independence raised both hopes and questions. Did Jefferson's words mean all men are created equal apply to them? Would independence bring an end to slavery? Should they join the Revolution? Even before independence was declared, a number of African Americans had joined the Patriot cause. Black militiamen fought at Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill. Early in the war, however, blacks were banned from the Continental Army. Washington did not want the army to become a runaway haven for slaves. In contrast, the British promised freedom to all those who took arms for the king. As a result, thousands of runaways became loyalists and fought for Britain. A shortage of volunteers soon forced Washington to change his mind. By 1779, 15% of the soldiers in the Continental Army were African Americans. Large numbers of black sailors also served in the Continental Navy. As black Americans joined the war effort, whites began to question their own beliefs. How could we accept slavery if we truly believe that all men are created equal, with the same rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? By the end of the war, Vermont, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania had all taken steps to end slavery. Page 91. On August 27, 1776, the British and American armies met in Brooklyn, New York, for what promised to be a decisive battle. The Americans began the defense of their city in high spirits, but the inexperienced Americans were no match for the British with their greater numbers and superior training. In 2 days of fighting, the British only lost 377 men, while the Americans lost 1,407. Satisfied that the war was nearly won, Howe ordered a halt to the British attack. Washington, he assumed, would do what any self-respecting European general would do in a hopeless situation. He would surrender honorably. So Howe waited. Washington had no intention of giving up. But for his army to survive, he would have to retreat, even though Washington knew he could not bring himself to utter the shameful word retreat. An officer named James Mifflin rescued him from his pride. What is your strength? Mifflin asked. 9,000, Washington replied. Not enough. Mifflin bluntly said, we must retreat. Fading hopes. The Battle of New York City had been the first of many defeats for the Americans. In the weeks that followed, the British forces chased the Americans out of New York, through New Jersey, and finally across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. For Joseph Martin and his comrades, this was a trying time. There was little food to eat, and the soldiers grew weak from hunger. As the weather turned cold, muddy roads and icy streams added to their misery. With their terms of enlistments nearly up, many soldiers headed for home. Along the way, they spread the word that everyone who volunteered to risk his life in the Continental Army would be crazy. By the time Washington reached Pennsylvania, he only had a few thousand men. Many of the remaining troops, he reported, were entirely naked, and most of them in so thinly clad clothing they were unfit for service. More troops had to be found, and found quickly, he wrote to his brother. Otherwise, I think the game is pretty well up. Page 92. A pep talk and surprise victories. By the end of 1776, the British also thought that the war had been won. General Howe offered pardons to the rebels who signed a statement promising to return to peaceful obedience to the king. Thousands took him up on this offer. The crisis. Washington knew that he had to do something, and something quickly. Gathering up the last of his troops, he read to them Thomas Paine's new pamphlet, The Crisis. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of this country. But he who stands now deserves the love and thanks of every man and woman. Next, Washington outlined the daring plan to attack Hessian troops who were camped in the winter at Trenton, New Jersey. Heartened by Paine's words, his men did not shrink from the service of their country. Victory in Trenton. Late in December 1776, Washington's army crossed the ice-choked Delaware River in small boats on the New Jersey shore. Washington gave his men the password for the long night's march, victory or death. As the Americans made their way towards Trenton, a driving snow chilled them to the bone. Ice and rocks cut through their worn-out shoes. One officer reported to Washington that the troops' guns were so wet they couldn't fire. Use bayonets, the general replied. The town must be taken. When the Americans reached Trenton, they found the Hessians sleeping after their Christmas feast. Caught completely by surprise, the mercenaries surrendered. Washington took 868 prisoners without losing a single man. A week later, the Americans captured another 300 British troops at Princeton, New Jersey. These defeats told Howe that it would take more than capturing New York City and issuing pardons to win the war. News of Washington's victories electrified patriots. A few days ago, they have given up the cause for lost, wrote an unhappy loyalist. Their late success have turned the scale, and they are all liberty mad again. The game is not up. Page 93. When the revolution began, both sides adopted military strategy, or an overall plan for winning the war. That strategy was to defeat the enemy in one big battle. After barely escaping New York, Washington revised his strategy. In the future, he wrote to Congress, he would avoid large battles that might put his army at risk. Instead, he would be a defensive rather than defeating the British. Washington hoped to tire them out. New British strategy. Germain revised the British strategy as well. His new plan was to divide the rebels by taking control of New York's Hudson River Valley. Control of this waterway would allow the British to cut New England off from the rest of the states. Without the men and supplies from New England, the Continental Army would surely collapse. To carry out this plan, General John Burgoyne left Canada in June of 1777 with 8,000 British soldiers and Indian warriors. He planned to move the army south to Albany, New York, where he would meet up with General Howe, who was supposed to march his army north from New York City. Problems with Burgoyne's plan. There was two big problems with Burgoyne's plan. First was that it looked like it was an easy invasion route on the map, but it wasn't easy. The route Burgoyne had chose from Canada to Albany took his army through more than 20 miles of tangled wilderness. With his army had to build huge bridges, chop down countless trees, and lay down miles of log roads through the swamp as they crept to Albany. To make matters worse, Burgoyne did not travel light. His army was slowed by more than 600 wagons, 30 of them filled with his personal baggage. Even in the wilderness, Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne sipped champagne with his supper. The second problem with Burgoyne's plan is that Howe had his own ideas on how to win the war. Instead of going to Albany, Howe moved to Philadelphia, the rebels' capital, where he hoped to lure Washington into another major battle. Howe hoped it would be the last one. Washington, however, refused to risk his army in another big battle. He would not fight for Philadelphia. Instead, he played hide and seek with Howe, attacking here and there and then disappearing into the countryside. The turning point. By the time the slow-moving Burgoyne finally marched to Saratoga Springs on the Hudson River, the area was swarming with militia. Although the rebels outnumbered his army, Burgoyne ordered an attack. Again and again, the rebels beat back Burgoyne's troops. On October 17, 1777, Gentleman Johnny accepted defeat. Burgoyne's surrender marked a turning point in the war. Before the victory at Saratoga, the American cause had looked hopeless to most of the world. Now the Americans had shown that they could stand up to the British and win. Not long after the victory, France became an ally of the United States. The French government sent money, weapons, troops, and warships to the Americans. Spain also entered the war against the Britain, and the Americans' cause no longer looked so hopeless. Saratoga, or Valley Forge. Saratoga was a stunning victory, but the war was far from over. While General Washington's army roamed the countryside, Howe's forces still occupied Philadelphia. In late 1777, Congress declared Thanksgiving. By the time Washington's army were on the way to Valley Forge, Pennsylvania to make a camp for the winter, Joseph Martin described the army celebration. We had nothing to eat for 2 or 3 days previous, but we must now have what Congress said, a scrumptious Thanksgiving. It gave each of every man a gill of rice and a tablespoon of vinegar. The army now not only starved us naked, the greatest part were only the shirtless and barefoot, but desolate without all other clothing, especially blankets. Washington's troops were hungry because their farmers preferred to sell the food to the British. The British paid them in gold, while Congress paid them in paper money. As far as uniforms and blankets, merchants had raised the prices of these items to sky high. The desire for profits at the army's expense outraged Washington. No punishment, he fumed, is too great for a man who will build his greatness upon this country's ruin. Page 95. To distract his men from their misery, Washington put Baron Frederick von Steuben, a volunteer from Prussia, in charge of training. The Prussians' methods, wrote Martin, was to continue to drill. It worked wonders. The army grew stronger every day, wrote one officer. There is a spirit of discipline among the troops that was better than the numbers. Another foreign volunteer, Marquis de Lafayette, also helped raise the troops' spirits. Although he was one of the richest men in France, Lafayette chose to share the hardships of Valley Forge. He even used his own money to buy blankets for the men and warm clothing. The patent fortitude of the officers and soldiers, Lafayette wrote, was a continual miracle. While at last spring arrived, Washington received news that the British were about to abandon Philadelphia. The time had come to put his newly trained army to the test.